Okay, let's unpack this. You've probably used one of those really capable AI chatbots, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you asked it for some facts or, to summarize something complicated, and it just, well, it confidently gave you something that felt a bit off.
Yeah, maybe something that sounded totally convincing, but you just couldn't track it down anywhere.
Exactly. That experience, it actually has a specific name in the AI world.
It does indeed.
It's called an AI hallucination. It's when these systems, particularly the large language models or LLMs we tend to interact with now, generate content that seems perfectly plausible.
Sounds grammatically correct, delivered super confidently.
Right, but it's actually factually incorrect.
Yeah.
Or maybe even completely made up.
And this isn't like a simple bug you might find in older AI, because these LLMs are built for such open-ended general chat.
Yeah.
Their mistakes often show up as just inventing facts about the real world, or maybe contradicting information you just gave them.
So for this deep dive, we've gathered a few key sources. We've got this really comprehensive academic survey. It lays out the principles, the types, the causes, all the challenges around LLM hallucinations.
And alongside that, we've got several articles, from news outlets, research perspectives, looking at the real-world impact, the ethics, potential solutions.
Right. Our mission today, and this is curated specifically for you, is to take all this material and really quickly get to the core.
So why do these models make things up?
What different forms do these errors, these fabrications take?
And maybe most importantly, what's actually being done or explored to try and tackle this pretty critical challenge.
All right, let's start with the basics, the definition. Based on these sources, what exactly is a hallucination at its heart?
Well, fundamentally, it's generating content that seems plausible, but it's just non-factual.
Sounds right, looks right.
But it doesn't actually check out, either against reality or sometimes against the specific information you just provided in the prompt.
Okay, and that academic survey you mentioned, it offers a really helpful way to think about the different types of these errors, doesn't it?
It does. It kind of splits them into two broad categories. Problems with facts, so factuality, and problems with faithfulness.
Let's start with factuality. Factuality hallucinations. So this is when the AI's output contradicts real-world facts, or it invents stuff that just doesn't exist.
Exactly. It's wrong about the world outside the conversation.
Get an example from the sources.
Sure. So if you ask about history, maybe inventions, a model might confidently tell you Thomas Edison invented the telephone.
Okay, that's wrong. Bell, right.
Right. So that's an error about an entity. It got the person wrong. Or, maybe slightly more subtly, it says Edison invented the light bulb.
Which he's famous for, but...
But he didn't invent the first one. He significantly improved existing designs. So that's more like a relation error. The connection between Edison and inventing the light bulb is misrepresented. These are factual contradictions.
Getting the who wrong, or getting the what they did wrong. Got it. And what about the other kind of factuality issue, inventing things?
Yeah. That also falls under factuality, but the survey calls it factual fabrication. And some examples are just, bizarre. Like claiming the construction of the Eiffel Tower led to the extinction of something called a Parisian tiger.
A Parisian tiger.
Yeah, it's completely unverifiable because, there's no such animal. Or maybe exaggerating wildly, like claiming the Eiffel Tower single-handedly started the entire global green architecture movement.
Okay, that sounds like a stretch.
It's an unsupported claim. It's basically a fabrication, just maybe sounds a bit more plausible than a made-up tiger.
Okay, so factuality is about being wrong about the real world or just plain making stuff up about it. What was the other main type? Faithfulness hallucination.
Faithfulness is different. This is when the output isn't faithful to the specific context or the instructions you gave the model right there in the conversation.
So it's not about general world knowledge, it's about paying attention to me.
Precisely. It ignores or misuses the information it was just given. So if you ask it to translate, say, what is the capital of France into Spanish, but instead of translating, it just answers Paris. It failed the instruction you gave it. That's instruction inconsistency.
Gotcha. It didn't do what I asked.
Or maybe you provided some specific context. Let's say you told it, the Nile River originates in the Great Lakes region of Africa.
Okay.
And then later you ask it to summarize, and it says the Nile originates from high mountain ranges. That's context inconsistency. It contradicted the information you provided.
Even though I just told it otherwise.
And sometimes it's even more subtle. It might show up as logical inconsistency, like walking through a math problem step by step, everything looks correct.
Yeah.
Until the very final answer, which somehow completely contradicts the steps it just showed you, the internal logic breaks down at the end.
Wow. Okay, that taxonomy is actually really useful. It shows these aren't just like random glitches. They fall into different kinds of wrong.
Either wrong about the world or unfaithful to the immediate conversation.
Yeah, it definitely helps frame the problem beyond just saying, oh, it made a mistake.
Exactly.
Okay, now this is where I think it gets really interesting. The sources dig into why. Why do all these different types of errors happen?
Right. And that academic survey breaks the causes down into 3 big areas. Issues with the data the model learned from, problems during the training process itself, and then issues during inference. That's when it's actually generating the response for you.
Let's start with hallucination from data. This feels fundamental if the stuff it learned is flawed.
Well, yeah, garbage in, garbage out, or maybe slightly off data in, confidently wrong stuff out.
Huh. Okay. So what kind of data problems are we talking about?
The sources point to a few key things. One is just misinformation and biases that are already present in the huge amounts of text data used for training.
So if the internet contains errors or biased views,
the model learns them, it reads them, absorbs the patterns, and then it can repeat them. One of the sources, AM Research, specifically notes how automatically generated content, which might have biases, is increasingly getting into the data stream.
Which creates a kind of feedback loop.
Potentially, yeah. Perpetuating those biases. So it just mimics the errors or the slant that it saw frequently in its training data.
Okay. What else under the data umbrella?
Another big one is the model's inherent knowledge boundary. It simply doesn't know everything.
Makes sense.
It particularly struggles with what the survey calls long-tail knowledge.
Yeah.
Really specific, less common facts or information.
The obscure stuff.
Exactly. And crucially, its up-to-date knowledge is basically frozen at the point its training finished. It can't access real-time information about current events.
Ah, okay. That explains that example in one of the sources about the 2024 U.S. election.
Right.
If its knowledge cut off before, say, a candidate dropped out, it might confidently make up stuff about current polling based on outdated information or just patterns it learned.
Precisely. It tries to fill the gap, but it's guessing based on old data. There's also copyright-sensitive knowledge. Often, very recent copyrighted material, like a new novel, isn't included in training data.
So if I ask about the ending of a brand new book,
it might just make something plausible up because it genuinely hasn't read it and can't access it.
Fascinating. What about this other term, imitative falsehood?
Yeah, this is related to how often things appear in the data. The model might repeat something incorrect simply because that incorrect version showed up way more often in the training text than the correct version did.
Even if the right answer was in there somewhere.
Exactly. The sheer frequency of the error makes the model think it's the standard or correct answer. The classic example is the Edison invented the light bulb thing again. If that inaccuracy was all over the training data.
It just pairs it back.
Pretty much. The frequency of an error kind of reinforces it for the model.
Okay, so that's the data bucket. Lots of potential pitfalls there. What about hallucination from training? Issues during the actual learning process?
Well, the sources mention challenges right from the pre-training phase. Models might become sort of overconfident in the facts they've memorized during that massive initial training.
Like they trust their memorization too much.
Something like that.
Right.
And errors introduced early can sometimes cascade, leading to bigger problems later in training. A really key point, especially in what's called supervised fine-tuning, SFT,
okay,
is that models are often trained to always give an answer, even if the question is outside their knowledge base or they aren't really certain.
Wait, they're basically trained not to say, I don't know.
In many cases, effectively, yes. The training encourages providing some kind of response, which often leads to fabrication when the model lacks genuine knowledge or confidence. The sources note they just aren't very good at expressing uncertainty anyway.
That seems counterintuitive.
It's a complex trade-off during training design. The sources also mention reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF, another training stage for alignment, can also contribute to hallucination issues, though the specific mechanisms are a bit more involved.
Okay. And the third big cause category was inference. So this happens after training, when the model is actually generating a response for me.
Right, when it's thinking on its feet, so to speak. Problems here can include imperfect decoding strategies.
Decoding.
That's basically how the model chooses the next word and the next word to build its answer. It's a statistical process. If that process isn't quite right, it can kind of veer off into making stuff up.
And I see overconfidence mentioned here again.
Yes, during inference, the model might still generate an output even when its internal calculations suggest low certainty. Some research mentioned in the sources suggests that internal mechanisms meant to sort of inhibit answering when unsure can sometimes fail.
So the internal, maybe don't answer this circuit, breaks down.
It seems it can, yeah, leading to these confidently delivered but incorrect responses. And finally, there's reasoning failure.
Okay.
LLMs can really struggle with complex logic, multi-step problems, or sometimes even basic deductive reasoning. There's this phenomenon researchers call the reversal curse.
Reversal curse.
Yeah, where a model might learn A is B, but then fail to understand that B is A. It struggles to reverse the relationship. These kinds of reasoning gaps during the inference process can lead to outputs that just don't make sense or contradict themselves.
Wow. Okay. So it's really not just one thing, is it? It's problems with the data it learned from, potential issues in how it was trained, and hiccups in how it actually figures out what to say in the moment.
Exactly. It's a really complex interplay of factors across the model's entire life cycle.
So let's circle back. What does all this mean for you listening? Why should you care if these models sometimes make stuff up?
Well, fundamentally, because these tools are being used more and more, often in really critical ways, the sources really emphasize the need for reliability as LLMs get baked into search engines, work tools, you name it.
And the stakes can be pretty high, right? We saw those examples cited lawyers using AI for legal briefs and ending up citing completely fake court cases.
Yeah, that lawyer got fined significantly. It highlights the potential for really serious real-world consequences.
And the sources mention other sensitive areas, too. People exploring AI for things like mental health support or medical advice.
Or even just inventing recipes. The AP News piece mentioned a computer scientist working on AI for complex Indian cooking, where one wrong hallucinated ingredient could totally ruin a dish like biryani. The risks in medical or legal contexts are obviously much higher.
And there's this other worrying angle. The problem might actually get worse over time because of how AI-generated content is flooding the internet.
That's a major concern raised, especially in the academic survey. LLM-generated content, which might contain these very hallucinations we're talking about, is becoming part of the online information ecosystem.
Which is then used to train future AI.
Exactly. And worse, some modern information retrieval systems, the kind used perhaps in search engines or RAG systems we'll discuss, might actually favor the style of AI-generated text, even if it's wrong.
Creating this nightmare feedback loop where AI learns from its own mistakes, amplifying misinformation.
It's a serious potential problem. Unsettling, as you said.
The sources also talked about the psychological impact, didn't they? How we react to this stuff.
They did. There's decades of psychology research showing people tend to put more faith in agents, human or otherwise, that sound confident.
And chatbots sound very confident.
Extremely confident, even when they're completely fabricating things. This makes the misinformation they spread feel more believable and harder to correct once someone's accepted it.
That psychology paper mentioned the window of curiosity. Once you get that confident-sounding answer,
you stop looking, you feel like you have the information, so you're less likely to question it or accept a correction later on. And just the general hype around AI, the constant talk about how powerful it is, can lead users to overestimate its reliability, making the problem worse.
So, okay, given all these challenges, this fundamental issue, is it even fixable? I know the sources had different takes on this.
Yeah, there's definitely a debate. That AP News article quotes Professor Emily Bender, who argues that hallucination is sort of an inherent mismatch. The tech does one thing, predict text, and we're trying to use it for something else, provide facts. From that view, she says it's not fixable.
That's a pretty strong stance.
It is. But then, on the other hand, you have OpenAI's CEO, Sam Altman, quoted in the same article expressing, optimism. He suggested they could get to a much, much better place within maybe a year and a half, 2 years.
So a real disagreement among the experts about whether this is fundamental or solvable.
Exactly. It's a live debate about the nature and the future potential of the technology itself.
Okay, so whether it's ultimately fixable or just something to manage, what are people actually doing about it right now? The sources covered quite a few mitigation strategies.
Yeah, and they tend to fall into similar categories as the causes we discussed. So first, there's data-related mitigation. Trying to improve the information the models learn from in the first place.
Like better quality control on the inputs.
Pretty much. Things like data filtering, trying to select only high-quality factual data, using reputable sources, removing duplicates. The huge challenge there is just the sheer scale of the data. And as we mentioned, that problem of AI-generated content getting mixed in.
Right. It's hard to filter perfectly.
Very hard. There's also work on model editing, which tries to go into an already trained model and directly fix or update specific incorrect facts stored in its parameters.
Like performing surgery on the model's knowledge.
Kind of, yeah. And then there's retrieval augmented generation, or G, which we should definitely talk more about. But it's data related because it tries to ground the AI's answers in external, hopefully more reliable data sources while it's generating the response.
Okay, we'll park R for a moment. What about fixing things during training or at the inference stage?
So researchers are working on training methods designed to make models less prone to hallucinate from the start. It's complex, but they're trying to tweak the learning process. Then, during inference, when the model is generating text, there are strategies like factuality or faithfulness enhanced decoding.
That sounds technical.
It is a bit, but the idea is to adjust how the model picks the next word. Maybe making it pay more attention to the context it was given, or using other checks to guide it towards more factual statements. There are also post-edit approaches.
What's that?
That's where the model generates an initial answer, and then another process, maybe involving retrieving information, reviews, and revises that answer to try and catch errors.
Like it proofreads its own work.
Sort of, yeah. Kind of research then revise workflow built into the system. But maybe just as important as what the developers are doing are the user-side mitigation tips from some of those news and opinion sources, practical things you can do.
This is crucial for everyone listening. What should people do?
Number one, absolutely critical. Independent verification. You just have to fact-check the outputs, especially if the information is important.
Don't just trust it blindly.
Never. Check any sources the AI claims to use. Sometimes it makes those up too. Look for potential bias in the information, check publication dates, see if reputable sources are saying the same thing. One source advised looking for red flags, basically. If anything sounds a bit fishy or too good to be true, be extra skeptical.
So treat the AI output like a starting point for your own research, not the final answer.
Exactly. And related to that is understanding limitations. Remember, these aren't human minds. They're incredibly sophisticated pattern-matching systems predicting likely word sequences.
They don't know things in the way we do.
Right. The CNET article had a simple tip. Ask the same question or a slightly rephrased version a couple of times. If you get wildly inconsistent answers, that's a sign the model might not be reliable on that topic.
That's a good practical test.
Finally, the sources stress staying informed about how this technology works and its pitfalls. And for organizations, establishing clear policies on how employees should and shouldn't use AI tools is becoming really important.
Okay, so summarizing the fixes, improve the data going in, tweak how the models learn and generate text, and then crucially, as users, we need to be super vigilant, fact-check everything, and understand what these tools actually are.
It really has to be a multi-pronged approach. There's no single magic fix right now.
Okay, let's do that quick deep dive now into retrieval augmented generation, or RG. You mentioned it as a mitigation strategy. Sounds like a great concept. Hook the AI up to an external knowledge base, like a database or recent documents, so it can pull in real-time factual info.
Yeah, it's a very promising approach, and it's designed specifically to combat hallucination by grounding the model's answers in external evidence rather than just its internal, potentially outdated or flawed knowledge.
But you also hinted it's not perfect. That academic survey said RG systems themselves can still hallucinate.
Yes, and this is where it gets really intricate. The survey digs into why RG can still fail. It boils down to two main areas where things can go wrong. Either the system fails to retrieve the right information from the external source in the first place, that's retrieval failure.
Or it actually gets the correct information, but then the language model fails to use that information properly when generating the final answer. That's called the generation bottleneck.
All right, let's break down retrieval failure first. How does it manage to not get the right info?
Several ways. The user queries themselves can be a problem if your question is ambiguous. The source uses the example fastest mile. Does the user mean the fastest mile run by a human or the fastest mile driven by a car? If the query is unclear, the retriever might pull up documents about NASCAR when you wanted track and field records.
Ah, okay. Ambiguity confuses it.
Right. Or sometimes the system might retrieve information unnecessarily. Like if you ask, what's the boiling point of water? That's common knowledge the LLM likely knows. But the RG system might still go search its external database, pull up potentially irrelevant documents about thermodynamics, and get confused.
So bad questions or unnecessary searching. What else makes retrieval fail? The retrieval sources themselves can be flawed. The external database that ARIAC is querying might contain unreliable info, outdated facts, or biased content.
Garbage in, garbage out again, but this time from the external source.
Exactly. And here's that feedback loop problem again, specifically highlighted in the RA context. The survey warns that AI-generated content is increasingly finding its way into these external knowledge bases.
So RA could end up retrieving and relying on information that was itself hallucinated by another AI.
That's the concern. And retrieval algorithms might even prefer the linguistic style of AI text. Plus, sometimes the ineffective retriever, the actual search component of the RA system, just might not be sophisticated enough to consistently find the most relevant documents for a given query, even if they exist in the database.
Okay, so retrieval can fail because of the question, the source data, or the search tool itself. What about the other failure point, the generation bottleneck? It has the right documents now, but still messes up.
Yes. This comes down to the LLM's own limitations in handling the retrieved context. One issue is contextual awareness. The model might struggle to effectively use all the information in the documents it received.
Like it doesn't understand them properly.
Or it gets confused. It can be misled by noisy or irrelevant bits of information that were retrieved alongside the good stuff. It also has trouble when the retrieved context conflicts with its own internal pre-trained knowledge. It might ignore the new info or mix them up. And there's this really interesting finding about insufficient utilization of context, particularly for information that's buried deep in the middle of long retrieved documents.
It just skips the middle.
Some models seem to have trouble properly attending to information in the middle of long contexts. It's sometimes called the lost in the middle phenomenon. The survey suggests it might be linked to technical aspects of the model's architecture.
Fascinating. Okay, what else under generation bottleneck?
The final piece is contextual alignment. Even if the model reads and understands the retrieved context, its final generated output might not faithfully or accurately reflect that information. It might summarize inaccurately, subtly change the meaning, or still inject its own unrelated knowledge.
So even with RAG trying to tether it to reality, the LLM can still slip the leash, basically, because of bad inputs, bad sources, or just its own struggles processing and relaying the information faithfully.
It really shows how deep this hallucination challenge runs. Even systems designed specifically to address it have their own vulnerabilities.
Wow. It's definitely a tough problem.
Yes.
So just to kind of bring this all together, AI hallucinations are clearly this really complex, multifaceted challenge for large language models.
Absolutely. Rooted in the data they eat, the way they're trained, and the tricky process of actually generating language on the fly.
And as we just discussed, they can even pop up in systems like RAG that are specifically designed to stop them.
Understanding these different facets, the why and how, is just so important for you as someone using these tools.
Right. It's about being informed enough to use them responsibly, isn't it? To navigate this information landscape that's changing so fast.
And knowing when you need to be skeptical, when you absolutely need to double-check the information you're getting, it requires developing a critical eye for AI outputs.
Definitely. And, it leaves us with this really potent final thought to mull over based on everything we've discussed.
Which is?
As more and more AI-generated content, potentially containing these very errors and hallucinations, keeps pouring into the online world, into the databases. The very data used to train and augment the next generation of AI.
Yeah.
What does that feedback loop truly mean for our collective grasp on factual knowledge, on verifiable truth in this digital age we're living in?
That's a really big question to think about.